Welcome this evening to the Legatum Institute. We are absolutely delighted that each and every one of you is here. Before we kick off, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Legatum Institute. My name is Philippa Stroud, and I am the CEO here. And we are an institute dedicated to building a movement of people who will create pathways from poverty to prosperity and also are committed to the transformation of society. We do that in a number of different ways. One of the ways in which we do it is through the raising up of leaders of character. And for those of you who have been regular attenders at Legatum events, you will know that we are running a Road to Character series here. And we have had people like Baroness Helena, not Baroness, I've just promoted her, Dame Helena Morrissey. We have had Peter Bazalgette, and just a couple of weeks ago we had Lord Dubbs here speaking on compassion, which was remarkable. So not only do we seek to raise up leaders of character, but we also committed to restoring an ethical vitality to our great institutions. So we run dinners here for people from the media, from politics, from the world of business. We had a business forum meeting here this morning with Lord Hastings, which was a wonderful event. But then we want to also, through our work, our research work and our data work, support leaders of nations to build those pathways from poverty to prosperity through building open economies. And we've just been in the US launching our work on open economies, empowered people, and inclusive societies. And we know that we as an organization will never, ever, ever do that on our own. And this is very much a movement of people, a network of people working together through everyone's skills and talent. And so, as I say, we're absolutely delighted that each and every one of you could be here with us tonight. But the main reason why we're delighted that you're here tonight is because we have the honour and the privilege of welcoming David Brooks here. Now, David, we are hoping that this will become his home away from home, and he's just had a lovely time in our library recognising all the books on our shelves as the books that are on his shelf. So we got to step one of this campaign. But just to tell you a little bit about David, he started at the Washington Times, then the Wall Street Journal, a Weekly Standard, the Newsweek, New York Times, which obviously you do your column twice a week at the New York Times, NewsHour, and 6 books. Probably an awful lot more than that as well. But as impactful as these extraordinary achievements are, I think he's about to tell us that they are first mountain order issues. And the subject matter that he wants to speak to us about tonight is his second book, which is not his second book, but The Second Mountain. So David, I just want to really welcome you. I'm delighted this is your home from home, to come and address us tonight on the matter of The Second Mountain. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you. First, it's good to be in England. I grew up in a Jewish culture where the slogan was, think Yiddish, act British. And so we were deeply Anglophilic. My turtles as a kid were named Disraeli and Gladstone. My mother did a dissertation on Wimbledon Common, my father on John Ruskin. So we were deep into Victoriana. And so we house swapped with Margaret Drabble. So this is my cultural home. And Legatum is become my London intellectual partner home. I've been here a few times now, and I've always felt these are my people. I'm so honored that you did the Road to Character as a lecture series. My intellectual property lawyers will be in touch in the morning. And on the way out, you'll see a picture of Mr. Brooks on the lobby. Unfortunately, it's Arthur Brooks, my friend from the American Enterprise Institute, but no one gets respect. So I'll just tell you quickly about my life in two different ways. One is external, the life we tell ourselves, and the other is internal. And so the external story is very clear and very clean. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and I decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. I remember in high school I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values, not hers. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia University and Wesleyan and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. Again, it's a writer, cerebral kind of place. The saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. But the better saying is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. So it's a very heady place. And I was a heady person there. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was at Chicago. And then I actually had the big break of my life, which is true. William F. Buckley came to campus, and I wrote a parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. It was like, at Yale, Buckley formed 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley and one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley Buckley. It was that sort of thing. And when he came to the campus, he gave a speech, and at the end of the speech, he said, "David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job." And that was literally the big break of my life. Sadly, I was not in the audience. I had actually been hired by Milton Friedman to go out to San Francisco to debate him on national TV. And it was a show where Milton talks to college students. And I was a socialist back then, and you can go on YouTube and see 21-year-old me debating Milton Friedman. I have the big head of hair. I had these 1980s glasses that were on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory, apparently. And I would regurgitate some socialist thing I'd read in a book. He would destroy it in about 6 words, and then the camera would linger on my face as I tried to think what to say. But then I called Buckley, and he set me up. And I worked for him, and then went on to a career in media. Now a conservative columnist of the New York Times, a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company. And then I have a job on something called the NewsHour, which is our closest thing we have to the BBC, though smaller and nichier. Our demographic is, we call them seasoned youth. So it's a little older, have seen the world. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. "I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it." And then I write these books, and I wrote this book on character 4 years ago, the last time I was here. And I learned writing a book on character that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character, and reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. And so that's a career pretty much caught up in the culture and pretty much caught up in the meritocracy. And along the way, you get to achieve a lot, but you sort of get sucked in by some of the lies of the meritocracy. And we have a very individualistic culture in both our countries, and we have a meritocratic culture. And there are certain lies that get embedded in you. And the first is career success can make you feel fulfilled. And in my experience, career success can help you avoid the feeling of shame you might feel if you were a failure, but it doesn't actually give you any positive fulfillment. The second lie is I can make myself happy, that happiness is an individual achievement. If I can only lose 15 pounds or get good at yoga or win some victory, I can be happy. But if you talk to the people at the end of their lives, they always look back and say, I was happiest when I defeated self-sufficiency, when I was completely dependent on somebody else and someone else was completely dependent on me, that they look back and they see relationship as the core of happiness. The third is that life is an individual journey. I don't know if you guys do it in the US. When a college kid graduates from college, we often give them this book called Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. And if you look at that book, it's a kid having a series of experiences on the way to success. He's got no friends, he's got no family, he's unattached. And it's the image we have that life is an individual journey. And I just ran into a sociologist who says, yeah, I give that book to immigrants, and they hate that book because it's not how they experience life. But it's sort of embedded in our consciousness. And then another lie is that you can find your own truth, come up with your own value system. And if your name is Aristotle or Nietzsche, maybe you can do that. Most of us cannot do that. And so you wind up with people who are morally inarticulate and morally numbed. And this is something our culture does a good job of morally numbing us. There's an Israeli daycare center in a few years ago, and the parents were coming in late to pick up their kids, and the teachers had to stay late to wait for them. And so they decided to impose fines on the parents for being late, and the number of people who came up late doubled. Because what had previously been a moral relationship with a teacher, to be fair to him or her, was turned into an economic transaction. And the moral lens was shut off, and the economic lens was put on. And our society is pretty good at doing that. And then there are the normal lies of the meritocracy, that you are what you accomplish, that you can earn dignity by attaching yourself to prestigious brands, that you can earn love through attachment, which is conditional love, that you're not a soul to be saved, your set of skills to be maximized. And then the most subtle thing, which we pretend we don't say, is that people who have achieved a lot more are worth slightly more than other people. And so all those things suck you in, and they lead you to lead a misled life, or at least they did for me, and I think for many others. Now, I started out with a bias towards solitude anyway. When I go into journalism schools, I tell the young students, if you're at a football game and everybody's doing the wave and you don't do the wave, you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist, because we just observe. As Gary Shandling said, my friends tell me I have an intimacy problem, but they don't really know me. So you start out with an aloof personality type, and then the craft itself is a very lonely craft. John Cheever was a writer in New York. He would get up at 6:30. He would put on his only suit and tie. He'd ride his elevator to the basement where he had an office. He took off the suit and tie. He wrote in his boxers. At 12:30, he put back on the suit and tie, rode up to his apartment, and made himself lunch. That's the life, very solitary. And then if you get some success, it's weirdly more solitary still. My last book, I was on book tour, and I was on book tour for 99 consecutive days. And at one point, I counted 42 consecutive meals eaten alone at a hotel, airport, or airplane. And when you're alone that much and traveling, you really are off the rails of all your normal attachments, and everything suddenly becomes fluid. I remember seeing a picture back then of Britney Spears, who went kind of crazy and shaved off all her hair. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. I'm not. And so all these cultural pressures led me and a lot of people to desire the wrong things. And my problem was I desired time. I valued time over people. Relationships take a long time to build, but if you have a productivity clock going in your head, it's very hard to take that time. And your people sense your own move. And so I went through a bad period in 2013, which was sort of my valley. My marriage had ended. My kids were either had gone off to college or were going off. I was in the conservative movement, but conservatism was shifting away from what I felt was real conservatism. And so I lost all those things. And so I did what any idiot would do when faced with sort of a crisis. I tried to work my way through it. And work is a really good way to avoid any spiritual or emotional problem. And so if you went to my apartment and you opened the drawers, where there should have been silverware, there were just Post-it notes. And where there should have been plates, it was just stationery, because I was never entertaining. And so it was just a life of work. And the weird thing is I was falling through the valley of disconnection, which is what it was. A lot of Americans were doing the exact same thing. And so we've seen a rise in the number of people who say they're lonely. 35% of Americans over 45 say they're chronically lonely. 55% of Americans say no one knows them well. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. Since 1999, the suicide rate has shot up by 30%. Since 2011, the teenage suicide rate has shot up by 70%. And so that's a crisis of disconnection. And it's attached to a crisis of distrust. A generation ago, if you ask people, do you trust your neighbors? 60% say, yeah, I trust my neighbors. Now it's 32% and 19% of millennials. The lower you down you go on the age scale, the more distrust there is. And then there's some sort of spiritual crisis that is hard to pin down. But here and in the US, depression rates are going up, mental health problems are rising. Every college I go to, their mental health facilities are swamped. And I'm not quite sure what that's about, but somehow we've lost some sense of stability. And so I went through this crisis, and I had now my pages are out of order, so I'm going to have to fake it. I'll just fake it. So I think what you had to do is you went through this crisis. And you can and I've learned a few things. Unfortunately, the Greeks say we suffer our way to wisdom. And the first thing I learned about the crisis was that freedom sucks. That political freedom's good, economic freedom is good, personal freedom sucks. The person who is unattached and uncommitted is unremembered and is just scattered. And so this idea of freedom as absence of restraint is a bad idea. When I was single, all my married friends were trying to project their fantasies onto me. Oh, it must be great to be a bachelor. You can do this, you can do that. I was like, no, you don't understand. It sucks. The second thing I learned is that you can be broken or you can be broken open. And some people are broken by the bad moments in their lives. They turn inward, they get afraid, they cover themselves over, and they become impenetrable. And they're often filled with resentments, and they lash out at the world. And those people who are, they turn tribal, basically. Tribalism seems like a way to be in community, but tribalism is actually the reverse of community. Community is based on mutual affection for a place or for a thing or for a cause. Tribalism is based on mutual hatred of some other. And so tribalism, it's always an us versus them mentality, friend-enemy distinctions. It's a zero-sum mindset. It's a scarcity mindset. It's distrust, erect barriers, build walls. And we have a lot of tribalism in our culture, both our countries, because there's a lot of broken people. If you leave people naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. Other people get broken open. And there's Paul Tillich is a 1950s theologian who said, what suffering does is it interrupts your life and it reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. He writes that what suffering does is it carves into the floor of the basement of your soul, and then carves through that, revealing a cavity below, and carves through that, revealing a cavity below. And so you see into deeper parts of yourself than you ever saw when you were just living in your normal life. And when you see into those depths, you realize only relational and spiritual food will fill them. And so normally we're living our life in the first mountain out of the desires of our ego. I want to make a difference. I want to be successful. I want people to like me. I want to rank a little better than other people. But once you're in the valley, a lot of those desires seem trivial. And you pick up two other sources of desire and prioritize them more. We've had a whole period since Danny Kahneman started doing his work where we've really begun to understand how decision-making works, how our cognitive processes work. And that's been a wonderful 30 years of discovery. To me, I hope the next 30 years is about where our desires come from. Because it's a mystery. Why do I like broccoli and not like scallops? I can't control that. Understanding the source of our desires seems to me a very important project in the years ahead. So you come up with two other sources of desire. And the first source of desire is the heart, the desires of the heart. Now, I have a friend who bought a house in suburban America, and he had a bamboo stand by the driveway. And he hated bamboo, so he chopped it down. He took an axe to the root system. He dug a 3-foot hole. He poured plant poison in it, 3 feet of gravel, 6 inches of concrete. 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo coming up. And in my view, we all have that. That's our desire. If you look at little kids at a school play, they are desiring to be great so fervently. And sometimes society does its best to cover over that desire. But the desire is still in there. The desire, and the primary desire of the heart is to attach, to become one with another special human being, but just to attach to people. There's a friend of mine said that when her first child was born, her first daughter, she said, "I loved her more than evolution required." And I've always liked that phrase because some things we do for evolutionary reasons, some things we do to pay the rent, but there's this specialness of being human is that there's some element of us which is enchanted and is just superfluous. And penguins are really close to their mates, But what we have for each other is just something special and enchanted. Annie Dillard calls it our complex and illimitable care for one another. And so when you're down the valley, you get in touch with that desire to be in intimate, deep contact with another. The second source of desire that you find in the valley is the soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God, not my department. But I do ask everyone to believe that they have a soul, that there's some piece of you that has no size, shape, color, or weight, but is of infinite value and dignity. Rich people don't have more of it than poor people. Old people don't have more of it than young people. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another person's soul. That rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules. It's an insult to another human being's soul. Roger Scruton defines obscenity as anything that covers up another person's soul. And so what does the soul do? First, it gives us moral responsibility. A tiger's not morally responsible for what it eats, but we are human, we have souls, so we are morally responsible for what we do. And the second thing it does is it makes us yearn for goodness. I've met a lot of people in the world, and some who've committed genocide, some who've done crimes, some who've led horrible lives. I've never met anybody who didn't want to lead a good life. And the people who have done very bad things always have some rationalization for why it was really good. And the soul yearns to serve some cause. It's Viktor Frankl territory. The soul yearns to lead a life of meaning and see one leading a life of meaning. And that desire is something else you discover at the bottom of the valley. And often it's discovered first by throwing yourselves on your friends, which is what I did. And in those days, I thought I shouldn't throw myself on my friends at 11:30 at night. They'll be annoyed. But they weren't annoyed. And now when my friends throw themselves on me at 11:30 at night, I'm delighted. It's a chance to deepen a friendship and do some good in the world. The second thing you have to do is go out in the wilderness and do some internal work. Henry Nouwen says sometimes you just have to stay in the pain to see what the pain has to teach you. And the good thing about the wilderness is that time slows down. The other good thing about the wilderness is that there's nobody there to applaud. So if you're a performative self, there's nobody, the rocks don't care. And so getting, the importance of the valley is the crushing of the ego, or at least the damaging of the ego. I don't think you ever get rid of your ego. I'm writing a book on selflessness. I check my Amazon rating like 19 times a day. But that's when you're transformed. And that leads you to something Einstein said. You're not going to get out of your problem at the same level of consciousness at which you created it. You have to have a better consciousness and a bigger consciousness. And then the final step of the valley is somebody pulling down and reaching and pulling you up. And I think it's impossible, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, to pull themselves out of their valley. They need somebody else pulling them out. And I was fortunate. When I was at a low period, I was invited over to a house of a husband and wife named Kathy and David. And they had a kid in the DC public schools who had a friend named James who his mom had health issues. And so they said, and James often didn't have a place to eat or sleep, so they said, well, James can stay with us. And James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. So the first time I went over to their house for dinner, there were 40 kids around the dinner table and 15 sleeping around the house. And I walked in, and I shook up my hand to reach in and introduce myself to one of the kids, and the kid said, we don't shake hands here. We just hug here. And I was raised on Anglophilic emotional reserve. Like I'm not a big hugger. But I've been going back for the last 5 years every Thursday night and just hugging along with those kids. And what the kids give us is a complete intolerance of social distance. You have to be emotionally transparent because they sure are. And they turn love into you, and you have to pour it back to them. And so we go around the table every Thursday night and we just throw our crap on the table. Some people feel depressed, somebody gets a job. One young girl, her kidney failed, and David, the father figure, gave her one of his. And I took my daughter there, and she said, that's the warmest place I've ever been. I took a guy named, I forget, Bill Milliken, who's about in his 70s. He started a very successful organization called Communities in Schools. And he said, listen, I've been doing youth work for 50 years. I've never seen a program turn around a life. Only relationships turn around lives. And so somehow this table is the technology of convening for tight relationships. And through them and other things, they taught me a better way to be. They lifted you up into a better way of being. And the good thing is, in the US and in the UK, there are millions of those people. We go into a town, I've got this project with the Legatum Institute called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and we go into a town and we say, who's trusted here? And we find 75, 100 amazing people in a day. They're just not covered by the media. So I was in Chicago, I ran into a woman named Aisha Butler. She lives in a bad neighborhood in Chicago called Englewood. She was gonna move out because she had a 9-year-old girl, bad neighborhood. And she, as the moving van was there, she looked across the street into an empty lot and she saw a girl in a pink dress playing with broken bottles in an empty lot. And she turned to her husband and said, we're not leaving. We're not going to be just another family that left that. They're going to see a married couple in their neighborhood. And so they decided to stay, and she Googled volunteer in Englewood. And now she runs the big organization called RAGE, which is the big community organization. Some of the people we found have had horrible valleys. A woman named Sarah Atkins in Appalachian, Ohio, she came back from an antiquing trip with her mom one Sunday afternoon, and she found that her husband had killed their kids and himself. And she now runs a free pharmacy. She works with moms who have suffered violence in their families. She teaches at Ohio University. She told me, I grew from this experience because I was angry. I was going to fight back against what he tried to do to me by making a difference in the world. He didn't kill me. My response to him was, whatever you meant to do to me, screw you. You're not going to do it to me. And so when I look at all these weavers, they have a value system that is very consistent. And it's the complete opposite of the meritocratic value system. My old mentor, Milton Friedman, said that we're motivated in classical economics, we're motivated by self-interest, desire for money, power, status. These people are not motivated by any of those things. They're motivated out of the heart and soul. They have a moral motivation. They have vocational certitude. They know why they were put on this earth. They're going to die doing this. They often had walkout experiences. They were part of some corrupt system they didn't believe in, and they left it. They have radical mutuality. Somebody said, I don't do things for people, I do things with people. We're all equal, we're all broken. They talk about the whole person. I'm going to treat the whole person. And then what they're really good at is relationship building. They're really good at relationships. Is there water? Oh, there's water right here. And so, for example, if you got into Harvard or Stanford for being good at relationships, they would all be at Harvard and Stanford. And so there's one organization called Roots of Empathy by a woman named Mary Gordon. And what they do is they teach kids empathy. And they do it by taking a mom and a 16-month-old infant, putting it in an 8th grade classroom, and the students sit around and they have to guess what's going on in the infant's head as he crawls around. It's a developing theory of mind. And one day there was a kid named Darren. And Darren was bigger than all the other kids because he'd been run through the foster care system, and he had seen his mom get killed. And he asked if he could hold the baby. And the mom was very nervous about this because Darren was so big and looked a little scary. But she let him hold the baby, and he was great with it. He just nestled with it on his chest, and they finally gave it back and started asking a bunch of questions about parenting. And the final one was, if nobody has ever loved you, do you think you could still be a good father? And so what these people do is they reach down to people in their valley and they lift them up. And so what we at Weave try to do is we think we need to shift the culture a little. We've had 60 years of hyper-individualism. What started out as a good idea, we've taken it too far. And the people who exemplify the values I think are superior are these weavers. And the theory of social change is that culture changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them. And these weavers have found a better way to live. It doesn't mean we all have to sacrifice our lives and have 40 kids at dinner every night. But if you had a different set of values of what norms are, then society would shift. And the problem with what these weavers do is they build relationships, and relationships don't scale. They take a long time to develop, and they're very local. But norms scale. And if you could shift a culture's norms about what it means to be a neighbor, what it means to be a person, how you behave in a workplace, what's expected of you in community, how it's expected that you be friends with somebody completely unlike yourself. If you shift those norms a little, then we get to a much better place. Thank you.